I decided to visit my wife at her job as a CEO. At the entrance, there was a sign that said authorized personnel only. When I told the guard I was the CEO's husband, he laughed and said, "Sir, I see her husband every day. There he is, coming out right now." So I decided to play along. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought a simple surprise visit would shatter everything I believed about my 28-year marriage. My name is Gerald. I'm 56 years old, and until that Thursday afternoon in October, I thought I knew my wife Lauren better than anyone in the world. It started as such an innocent idea. Lauren had been working late again, pulling those 12 and 14-hour days that came with being CEO of Meridian Technologies. I'd been making dinner for one too many nights, eating alone while she texted me updates about board meetings and client emergencies. That morning, she'd rushed out without her usual coffee, and I thought bringing her favorite latte and homemade sandwich might brighten her day. The downtown office building gleamed in the autumn sunlight as I pulled into the visitor parking space. I'd only been to Lauren's office a handful of times over the years. She always said it was easier to keep work and home separate, and I respected that boundary. Maybe I respected too many boundaries. I walked through the glass doors carrying the coffee and brown bag, feeling oddly nervous. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of intimidating corporate space that made me grateful for my quiet accounting practice. A security guard sat behind an imposing desk, his nameplate reading William. "Good afternoon," I said, approaching with what I hoped was a confident smile. "I'm here to see Lauren Hutchins. I'm her husband, Gerald." William looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something I couldn't quite read. He tilted his head slightly, studying my face, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You said you're Mrs. Hutchins's husband?" His voice carried a note of confusion that made my stomach tighten. "Yes, that's right, Gerald Hutchins. I brought her lunch." I held up the bag, suddenly feeling foolish. William's expression changed completely. His eyebrows shot up, and then he did something that froze my blood. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, bewildered laugh that echoed through the marble lobby. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I see Mrs. Hutchins' husband every day. He just left about 10 minutes ago." William gestured toward the elevators with casual certainty. "There he is now, coming back." I turned, following his gaze, and watched a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stride through the lobby. He was younger than me, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of confident bearing that seemed to own every room he entered. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him screamed success and authority. The man nodded to William with familiar ease. "Afternoon, Bill. Lauren asked me to grab those files from the car." "No problem, Mr. Sterling. She's in her office." Frank Sterling. I knew that name from Lauren's work stories, her vice president who joined the company 3 years ago, the man she occasionally mentioned in passing, always in professional context. Frank this, Frank that, always business. My hands felt numb around the coffee cup. The brown bag crinkled as my grip tightened involuntarily. Everything in me wanted to speak up, to correct this massive misunderstanding, but my voice had completely abandoned me. William was looking between Frank and me now, genuine confusion creasing his features. "I'm sorry, sir, but are you sure you're Mrs. Hutchins' husband? Because Mr. Sterling here is married to her." The words hit me like physical blows. Married to her, present tense, not was married, not claims to be married, but a simple, matter-of-fact statement that shattered my reality. Frank paused mid-stride, his attention drawn to our conversation. When his eyes met mine, I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, not surprise, but recognition. He knew exactly who I was. "Is there a problem here?" Frank's voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations. Something cold and calculating passed through my mind in that moment. Every instinct screamed at me to explode, to demand answers, to create the scene this situation deserved. But a deeper wisdom, born from 28 years of reading people and situations in my accounting practice, told me to play along. "Oh, you must be Frank," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. Lauren's mentioned you. I'm Gerald, a friend of the family. The lie tasted bitter, but it bought me time to think. I was just dropping off some documents for Lauren. Frank's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained watchful. Ah, yes. Lauren's mentioned you too. Had she? What had she said? She's in meetings most of the afternoon, but I can make sure she gets whatever you brought. I handed over the coffee and sandwich, my movements mechanical. Just tell her Gerald stopped by. Of course. Frank's smile was perfectly professional, perfectly normal, as if we hadn't just had the most surreal conversation of my life. I walked back to my car in a daze, my legs moving without conscious direction. The October air felt sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed. Everything looked the same as when I'd arrived 30 minutes ago, but my world had fundamentally shifted. Sitting in the driver's seat, I stared at the office building through my windshield. 28 years of marriage. 28 years of sharing a bed, a home, dreams, fears, inside jokes that nobody else understood. 28 years of believing I knew this woman, completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Lauren. Running late again tonight, don't wait up, love you. Love you. The words that had once brought me comfort now felt like another lie in what was apparently a web of deception I'd been blind to. How long had this been going on? How many times had Frank been introduced as her husband while I sat at home making dinner for one, believing her stories about late meetings and business dinners? I started the car and drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Our house looked the same, the red brick colonial we'd bought when Lauren first made partner at her previous firm, the garden she'd insisted on planting our second year there, the mailbox with both our names printed in careful script. Everything exactly as I'd left it, except now I knew it was all built on lies. Inside, the silence felt different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a home waiting for its occupants to return. It was the hollow emptiness of a stage set, a carefully constructed facade. I walked through rooms filled with our shared memories, vacation photos, wedding pictures, the ceramic bowl Lauren had made in that pottery class she'd taken 5 years ago. Had any of it been real? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. My mind kept replaying the scene at the office, searching for clues I'd missed, explanations that might make sense of what I'd witnessed. But there was only one explanation that fit, and it was one I wasn't ready to accept. The front door opened at 9:30, just as it had countless times before. Lauren's heels clicked against the hardwood floor, her keys jangled as she set them on the hall table. Normal sounds of a normal evening, except nothing was normal anymore. Gerald, I'm home. Her voice carried the tired warmth I'd grown accustomed to over the years. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking every inch the successful CEO in her tailored navy suit, her blonde hair still perfectly arranged despite her long day. How was your day? I asked, the question automatic. She sighed, loosening her jacket. Exhausting. Back-to-back meetings all afternoon. Did you eat already? I nodded, studying her face for any sign of deception, any hint that she knew about my visit to her office. There was nothing. Her expression was exactly what it had always been, tired, distracted, but genuinely glad to see me. I brought you coffee today, I said carefully. To your office. Lauren paused in the middle of reaching for a glass. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression. Then she smiled. You did? I didn't get any coffee. I gave it to Frank to pass along. Another pause, so brief I might have imagined it. Oh, Frank mentioned someone stopped by. I had back-to-back meetings all afternoon, so I probably missed it. She moved to the refrigerator, her back to me. That was sweet of you to think of me. I watched her pour herself a glass of wine, noting how her hands remained perfectly steady. Either she was telling the truth or she was the most accomplished liar I'd ever met. After 28 years of marriage, I was terrified to discover which one it was. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. We watched the news together, discussed our weekend plans, went through the same bedtime routine we'd followed for decades. But underneath it all, a terrible new awareness pulsed like a second heartbeat. As Lauren slept beside me, her breathing deep and peaceful, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other lies I'd been living with. How many times had she come home from spending the day being Frank's wife, only to slip seamlessly back into being mine? How long had I been sharing my life with someone who was living a completely different one when I wasn't around? The numbers man in me started calculating. 3 years since Frank joined the company. How many late nights, how many business trips, how many times had she mentioned his name in passing, conditioning me to accept his presence in her professional life while he was actually inhabiting something much more personal? But the questions that haunted me most weren't about timelines or evidence. They were simpler and infinitely more devastating. Who was the woman sleeping next to me, and who had I been married to all these years? The next morning arrived with cruel normalcy. Lauren kissed my cheek before leaving for work. The same quick peck she'd given me for years. She wore her favorite perfume, the one I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. Everything about her was familiar, comforting, exactly as it had always been. Except now I knew I was kissing a stranger. I called my office and told my assistant I'd be working from home. For the first time in my 15-year practice, I couldn't bear the thought of discussing tax returns and quarterly reports. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I stared at Lauren's coffee mug in the sink. She'd used it that morning just like always. Had she been thinking about Frank while she drank from it? By noon, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. Going through Lauren's things. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the methodical precision that had made me successful in accounting. I started with the obvious places. Her home office. The desk where she sometimes worked in the evenings. The drawers revealed nothing suspicious. Work papers, company letterhead, business cards from clients I recognized from her stories. Everything was exactly what it should be for a CEO who occasionally brought work home. But then I found something that made my stomach clench. A restaurant receipt from Chez Laurent, the French place downtown where we'd celebrated our anniversary 3 years running, dated 6 weeks ago, for 2 people. $68.50. I remembered that night, clearly because Lauren had told me she was having dinner with a potential client. A female client from Portland who was in town for just one evening. I stared at the receipt, my hands trembling slightly. The timestamp showed 8:15 p.m. We'd talked on the phone that night around 9:30. She'd sounded relaxed, happy, describing her challenging but productive client meeting. I'd been proud of her for landing what she'd described as a significant account. But this wasn't a business dinner receipt. No alcohol charges that would accompany client entertainment, no appetizers or desserts that Lauren would order to impress a potential client. Just 2 entrees and a bottle of wine. The kind of intimate dinner I thought was reserved for us. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Lauren's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, honey," I answered, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Hey, I just wanted to check in. You sounded a little off this morning." Her voice carried genuine concern, the kind of caring attention that had made me fall in love with her 29 years ago. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well." "Maybe you should take a real break today. You've been working so hard lately." The irony of her suggestion wasn't lost on me. While I'd been working hard at my small practice, she'd apparently been working hard at maintaining 2 separate lives. "Actually, I was thinking about that dinner you had with the client from Portland. The one about 6 weeks ago? How did that work out?" A pause. So brief that most people wouldn't notice it, but after 28 years of marriage, I knew Lauren's speech patterns. She was calculating. "Oh, that. It didn't pan out the way we'd hoped. She decided to go with a local firm." Her voice remained steady, casual. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You seemed excited about it at the time." "Well, you win some, you lose some." I could hear typing in the background. She was probably answering emails while talking to me, multitasking the way she always did. "I should get back to this board meeting prep. See you tonight?" "See you tonight." After she hung up, I sat staring at the receipt. Either she was lying about the client meeting or she was lying about the dinner. Either way, she was lying. I spent the rest of the afternoon like a detective in my own life, examining familiar things with new eyes. The credit card statements I'd always glanced at casually, trusting Lauren to handle our finances since she made 3 times what I did. Now I studied them line by line. Lunch charges on days when she told me she was brown bagging it to save money. Gas station purchases in neighborhoods across town, far from her usual routes. A charge at Barnes & Noble for $37.12 on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd supposedly been in back-to-back meetings. Lauren hadn't bought a book for pleasure reading in years, claiming she was too tired after work to focus on anything but trade magazines. But the most damning discovery came from her laptop. She'd left it open on the kitchen counter, something she'd been doing more frequently over the past year. I told myself I was just closing it to save battery, but my eyes caught a notification bubble in the corner of the screen. Frank Sterling had sent her a calendar invitation. I shouldn't have clicked on it. I knew I was crossing a line, violating her privacy in a way that would have horrified me just 24 hours earlier. But 24 hours earlier, I'd believed my wife was faithful. The calendar invitation was for dinner. Tonight. 7 p.m. at Bella Court, the Italian place that had become our special occasion restaurant. The place where Frank had proposed to me 17 years ago. The reservation was under Frank's name. My chest felt tight as I scrolled through more calendar entries. Lunch meetings with Frank that weren't labeled as business. Doctor's appointments that Lauren had never mentioned to me. A weekend spa retreat 3 months ago that she'd told me was a women's conference for female executives. But the entries that made me physically nauseous were the recurring ones. Coffee with F every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., dinner plans every other Thursday. Weekend planning marked for this coming Saturday when Lauren had told me she needed to work. I was looking at a parallel life, meticulously scheduled and carefully hidden. Frank wasn't just her work colleague or even her affair partner. Based on these calendar entries, he was her primary relationship. I was the side note, the obligation, the inconvenience worked around. The garage door rumbled open at 6:15. Lauren was home early, unusual for a Thursday. I closed the laptop quickly, my heart hammering as I heard her heels on the kitchen tile. "You're home early," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. She looked beautiful, I realized with a sharp pang. She'd refreshed her makeup, her hair was perfectly styled, and she was wearing the black dress I'd bought her for her birthday last year. The dress she'd said was too fancy for everyday wear. I managed to wrap up early for once. She moved past me to the refrigerator, her perfume trailing behind her. I thought maybe we could grab dinner out tonight. It's been forever since we did anything spontaneous. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that I almost believed it myself. If I hadn't seen the calendar invitation, I would have been thrilled by her suggestion. I would have rushed to change clothes, grateful for this unexpected attention from my successful, busy wife. "Where did you have in mind?" I asked. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe that new sushi place on 5th Street? Or we could try something completely different." She was checking her phone as she spoke, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I watched her type, wondering if she was texting Frank. Was she canceling their dinner? Rescheduling, or was this part of some elaborate game I couldn't even begin to understand? "Actually," she said, looking up from her phone with apparent disappointment, "I just remembered I have that conference call with the Tokyo office. It totally slipped my mind." She shook her head ruefully. "Rain check." "Of course." The words came out automatically, but inside something cold and hard was crystallizing. "What time is your call?" 7:30. Could run until 9 or 10. You know how these international things go." She was already moving toward the stairs, toward our bedroom where she kept her work clothes. "I'll probably just grab something quick on my way back to the office." I nodded, playing my part in this elaborate deception. "I'll make myself something here." She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. "You're so understanding, Gerald. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words that should have warmed my heart instead felt like ice picks. How many times had she said variations of this while preparing to spend the evening with another man? How many times had I smiled and kissed her goodbye, unknowingly sending her off to her real life? I watched her climb the stairs, listening to her movements in our bedroom. She was changing out of the black dress, probably into something more businesslike for her conference call. Or maybe into something entirely different for her dinner with Frank. 20 minutes later, she came back down wearing a navy blouse and dark slacks. Professional but attractive. Her makeup was perfect, her hair touched up. She looked like a woman preparing for an important evening, not someone settling in for a long phone conference. "I'll try not to be too late," she said, kissing my cheek. The same spot she'd kissed that morning, but now it felt like a betrayal instead of intimacy. "Take your time. I'll probably turn in early anyway." She gathered her purse, her laptop bag, her keys. The same routine I'd watched thousands of times, but now I knew I was watching an actress preparing to leave one performance for another. The house felt different after she left. Not empty, but haunted. Every familiar object seemed to mock me with its false comfort. The wedding photos on the mantel, the vacation souvenirs on the bookshelf, the coffee table we'd picked out together 10 years ago when we'd redecorated the living room. All of it was real, but none of it meant what I'd thought it meant. I made myself a sandwich and sat in front of the television, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept circling back to the same impossible questions. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs for so long? And most devastatingly, had our entire marriage been a lie, or had something changed along the way? At 8:30, I found myself driving past Bellecourt. I told myself I was just going to the grocery store, that this route was perfectly normal, but when I saw Lauren's silver BMW in the restaurant parking lot, parked next to a dark Mercedes I assumed belonged to Frank, the last thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. They were in there right now, sharing the same kind of intimate dinner I thought was exclusive to our marriage. Was he telling her he loved her? Was she laughing at his jokes the way she used to laugh at mine? Were they planning a future that didn't include me? I drove home in a daze, the weight of my new reality settling around me like a heavy coat. My wife of 28 years was living a double life so complete, so seamlessly integrated that I'd been completely blind to it. The woman I'd thought I knew better than anyone was a stranger. The marriage I'd believed was solid was apparently just the cover story for her real relationship. But perhaps the most shattering realization was this. I had no idea how long I'd been living this lie, and I had no idea what to do about it. The revelation came 3 days later, in the most mundane way possible. I was cleaning out the junk drawer in the kitchen, something I did quarterly to keep our household organized, when my fingers closed around a key I didn't recognize. It was brass, worn smooth at the edges, attached to a keychain from Harbor View Apartments across town. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. We owned our house outright, had for the past 8 years. Neither of us had any reason to have an apartment key, let alone one from a complex 30 minutes away from our neighborhood. That afternoon, while Lauren was at what she'd called a client presentation, I drove to Harbor View Apartments. The complex was nice, upscale but not ostentatious. The kind of place where successful professionals might keep a discreet second residence. I sat in my car in the visitor parking area, staring at the key in my palm and wondering if I really wanted to know what door it opened. The answer came when I saw Frank's Mercedes pull into a numbered space. I watched him get out, carrying a grocery bag and what looked like dry cleaning. He moved with the easy familiarity of someone coming home, not someone visiting. When he disappeared into Building C, I waited exactly 10 minutes before following. The key fit perfectly into apartment 214. The door opened onto a life I never knew existed. It wasn't a temporary hiding place or a secret meeting spot. It was a home. A fully furnished, lived-in home with photos on the mantel, books on the shelves, and Lauren's favorite throw pillows arranged on a couch I'd never seen before. But it was the photos that destroyed me completely. Lauren and Frank at what looked like a company Christmas party, his arm around her waist in a possessive, intimate way. The two of them on a beach I didn't recognize, both tanned and relaxed. Lauren wearing a sundress I'd never seen. Frank kissing her cheek while she laughed, her left hand visible and notably bare of the wedding ring she wore at home. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, cataloging evidence of a relationship that was clearly far more than an affair. This was a second life, complete and established. In the bedroom, Lauren's clothes hung next to Frank's in a shared closet. Her perfume sat on the dresser next to his cologne. The bathroom held 2 toothbrushes, her contact solution, the expensive face cream she claimed was too costly to repurchase when she'd run out 6 months ago. On the kitchen counter, I found the most devastating evidence of all, a folder labeled Future Plans in Lauren's handwriting. Inside were house listings in Frank's name, vacation brochures for trips I'd never heard her mention, and a business plan for expanding Meridian Technologies with Frank listed as CEO and Lauren as president. But at the bottom of the folder was something that made my hands shake, a consultation summary from Morrison & Associates Family Law. The letterhead was familiar because Morrison & Associates was the firm that had handled our will updates 5 years ago. According to the summary, Lauren had met with them twice in the past 4 months to discuss optimal divorce strategies for high-asset individuals. The document outlined her approach in clinical detail. She planned to file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. The strategy involved establishing a pattern of my alleged emotional unavailability, supported by what the lawyer called lifestyle incompatibility evidence. According to this plan, my preference for quiet evenings at home would be presented as social isolation. My satisfaction with my small accounting practice would become lack of ambition. My contentment with our modest lifestyle would be reframed as inability to support her professional growth. But the most chilling part was the timeline. Lauren had been planning this divorce for at least 2 years, carefully documenting instances of what she called my withdrawn behavior. She'd been creating a narrative of our marriage that painted me as an inadequate husband who'd gradually become emotionally unavailable. The woman I'd been living with, loving, trusting, had been systematically building a case against me while I remained completely oblivious. I sat on their couch, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, and tried to process the magnitude of the deception. This wasn't just an affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated replacement of one life with another. Frank hadn't just stolen my wife. He'd systematically assumed my role while I was gradually being written out of the story. My phone buzzed with a text from Lauren. "Running late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you." Love you. The same words she'd probably texted me from this very apartment, maybe while Frank was cooking dinner in their kitchen or while they were planning their next vacation together. How many times had she sent me loving messages, while actively living a completely different life? I photographed everything with my phone, my accountant's mind automatically creating the documentation I'd need later. The photos, the legal documents, the evidence of their shared residence. But as I worked, a strange calm settled over me. For 3 days I'd been tormented by uncertainty, by the gap between what I knew and what I suspected. Now I had answers, and while they were devastating, they were also clarifying. Lauren hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been conducting an elaborate long-term plan to transition from one life to another, with me as the unwitting supporting character in my own replacement. The woman I'd been married to for 28 years had spent the last several years methodically erasing me from her future while maintaining the facade of our marriage. When I got home, I found Lauren's laptop open on the kitchen counter again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened her email and found correspondence that confirmed everything I'd discovered at the apartment. Messages between Lauren and Frank discussing when to make the transition. Communications with her lawyer about preparing Gerald for the inevitable changes. Even emails to our mutual friends, subtly preparing them for what she called some difficult decisions I'll need to make about my marriage. One email to her sister Sarah, dated just 2 weeks ago, was particularly devastating. "Gerald's been so distant lately. I think he's going through some kind of midlife crisis, but he won't talk about it. I'm trying to be patient, but I can't sacrifice my own happiness indefinitely. Frank thinks I should consider all my options. Reading this, I realized that Lauren hadn't just been living a double life. She'd been actively rewriting our marriage history to justify her planned exit. Every quiet evening I'd spent reading while she worked on her laptop, every time I'd encouraged her to pursue her career ambitions, even when it meant less time together, every instance of my being supportive rather than demanding had been transformed into evidence of my inadequacy as a husband. The cruelest part was recognizing how she'd manipulated my own responses to support her narrative. When she'd started working later and traveling more, I'd been understanding. When she'd seemed stressed and distant, I'd given her space. When she'd suggested we needed better communication, I'd agreed to couples counseling, never realizing I was providing her with material to use against me later. That night, Lauren came home at nearly 11 o'clock, apologizing for her late evening with client entertainment. She kissed my cheek and asked about my day, the same routine we'd followed for years. But now I could see it for what it was. A performance designed to maintain the status quo until she was ready to execute her exit strategy. "How was the client dinner?" I asked, testing her reaction. "Productive, I think. We're trying to land this big contract, and sometimes these things require extra relationship building." She moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, making herself a cup of tea. Frank was there too, of course, since he'll be managing the account if we get it. Frank was there too, of course he was. I wondered if they'd laughed about this conversation later in their shared apartment while planning their shared future. "That's good," I said. "You and Frank work well together." Lauren paused, cup halfway to her lips. "We do. He really understands the business side of things." There was something in her voice, a warmth that she used to reserve for talking about me. "He's been instrumental in some of our biggest wins lately." I nodded, playing my part in this elaborate charade. But inside, I was calculating. How long did I have before she filed for divorce? How much more evidence did she need to gather to support her strategy? How many more times would I kiss her goodnight while she planned my replacement? As I lay in bed that night, listening to Lauren's peaceful breathing beside me, I realized that the woman I'd been married to for 28 years was essentially gone. In her place was someone who could maintain this level of deception with apparent ease, someone who could plan my emotional and financial destruction while accepting my love and support. But perhaps most devastating of all was the recognition that I'd been living with a stranger for months, possibly years, without ever suspecting it. The Lauren I thought I knew, the woman I'd built my life around, had been gradually replaced by someone capable of this level of calculated betrayal. The question now wasn't whether my marriage was over. The question was whether it had ever really existed at all. I chose Saturday morning for the confrontation. Lauren was in our kitchen wearing the pale yellow robe I'd bought her 3 Christmases ago, sipping coffee from her favorite mug while scrolling through her phone. It was the kind of peaceful domestic scene that had once filled me with contentment. Now it felt like watching a performance I could no longer pretend to believe. "We need to talk," I said, setting the folder of evidence on the kitchen table between us. Lauren looked up from her phone, her expression shifting from casual attention to sharp awareness as she saw the documents. Her coffee mug paused halfway to her lips, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face that might have been relief. "What's this about?" she asked, but her voice lacked the confusion it should have carried. She knew exactly what this was about. "I went to your apartment yesterday, the one at Harbor View." I sat down across from her, noting how her shoulders straightened, how her breathing shifted to something more controlled. "I used the key from our junk drawer." Lauren set down her mug with deliberate precision. When she looked at me again, the mask was gone. The loving wife, the concerned partner, the woman who'd been apologizing for late nights and long meetings had disappeared. In her place sat someone I barely recognized, someone whose eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. "I see." Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "How much do you know?" The question hit me like a physical blow, Not denial, not confusion, not even anger. Just a practical inquiry about the extent of my discovery, as if we were discussing a business problem that needed to be managed. Everything, I said. The apartment, Frank, the divorce planning, the legal strategy, all of it. Lauren nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I recognized from her board meetings. She was calculating, processing, deciding how to handle this unexpected development in her carefully orchestrated plan. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since Thursday, when I visited your office and the security guard told me he saw your husband every day." I leaned forward, studying her face for any sign of the woman I'd thought I'd married. He meant Frank. Something that might have been amusement passed across Lauren's features. "Poor William. He's always been a bit too chatty." She reached for her coffee again, her movements unhurried. "I suppose this complicates things." "Complicates things?" I could hear my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Lauren, we've been married for 28 years. You've been living with another man, planning to divorce me, and all you can say is that this complicates things?" She sighed, a sound of mild irritation rather than distress. "Gerald, let's not be dramatic about this. We both know this marriage has been over for years." "We both know?" I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman who'd kissed me goodbye every morning, who'd said she loved me just 3 days ago. "I didn't know anything. I thought we were happy." Lauren's laugh was short and utterly without humor. "Happy? Gerald, when was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you showed any interest in my career, my goals, anything beyond your little accounting practice and your quiet evenings at home? I've always supported your career. I've always been proud of what you've accomplished." "You've been passive," she corrected, her voice taking on the sharp edge I'd heard her use with underperforming employees. "You've been content to let me carry the financial burden, the social obligations, the responsibility for actually building a life worth living. You've been perfectly happy to coast along in your comfortable little routine while I've been growing, changing, becoming someone who needs more than you've ever been willing to offer." Each word felt like a carefully aimed dart, hitting targets I didn't even know were vulnerable. "If you felt that way, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me what you needed?" "I tried, Gerald. God knows I tried. But every time I brought up traveling more, expanding your practice, moving to a better neighborhood, you found excuses. You were always perfectly satisfied with exactly what we had, no matter how much I outgrew it." I thought about our conversations over the years, trying to remember these attempts at communication she was describing. There had been discussions about travel that I'd thought were casual daydreaming, suggestions about moving that I'd assumed were just idle speculation, comments about my practice that I'd interpreted as gentle teasing rather than serious criticism. "So you decided to replace me instead of work with me." Lauren's expression softened slightly, but not with affection. It was the kind of gentle patience she might show a slow student. "I didn't set out to replace you. I met Frank 3 years ago when he joined the company. He was everything you're not: ambitious, dynamic, interested in building something bigger than himself. At first it was just professional respect. Then it became friendship. Then it became more." "When?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "When what? When did it become more?" She considered this, tilting her head as if trying to recall the details of a business transaction. "About 2 years ago. Frank had just closed his first major deal with us. We went out to celebrate, and we ended up talking until 3 in the morning about our dreams, our plans, the kind of life we wanted to build. It was the most stimulating conversation I'd had in years. You came home that night. I remember you said the client dinner ran late. It did, in a way." Lauren's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "That's when I realized what I'd been missing. Frank listens when I talk about expanding the company internationally. He gets excited about the same opportunities that excite me. He wants to build an empire, not just maintain a comfortable existence." "And that justified lying to me for 2 years?" For the first time, Lauren showed a flash of real emotion. But it wasn't guilt or sadness, it was irritation. I wasn't lying, Gerald. I was protecting you from a reality you weren't ready to face. Our marriage was already over. You just didn't want to see it. Our marriage was over because you decided it was over, because you found someone who matched your ambitions better than I did. Our marriage was over because you stopped growing. Lauren stood up, moving to the window with the fluid grace that had first attracted me to her nearly 30 years ago. I kept hoping you'd develop some passion for something, anything beyond your routine. But you never did. You've been the same man at 56 that you were at 36, and I'm not the same woman. I stared at her profile against the morning light, recognizing the truth in her words even as they devastated me. I had been content with our life in ways that she apparently never was. I had found fulfillment in our quiet evenings, our modest successes, our stable routine. While she'd been dreaming of bigger things, I'd been grateful for what we had. So you and Frank have been planning to get rid of me. Lauren turned back to me, her expression businesslike. We've been planning our future. The divorce was always going to be necessary, but we wanted to handle it in a way that would be least disruptive to everyone involved. Least disruptive? I pulled out the legal consultation summary. You've been building a case against me for months, emotional abandonment, lifestyle incompatibility. You've been documenting everything I do to use against me later. She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The legal advice was to protect both of us. Divorce can get ugly if people aren't prepared. Protect both of us? Lauren, you've been systematically destroying my reputation with our friends, making me look like an inadequate husband who drove you to seek happiness elsewhere. I've been honest about the state of our marriage, she said defensively. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why. The circular logic was dizzying. She'd been unfaithful, deceptive, and manipulative, but somehow I was the one being asked to examine my behavior. It was a level of psychological manipulation that left me feeling unmoored, questioning my own perceptions. Do you love him? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Lauren's expression softened for the first time during our conversation, but not in a way that offered me any comfort. I do. I love Frank in a way I never loved you. He challenges me, inspires me, makes me want to be better than I am. With him, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing. And with me? She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze neither cruel nor kind, just honest. With you, I felt safe, comfortable, unchallenged. For a long time, I thought that was enough. But it isn't, Gerald. I want more than safe. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of her words. 28 years of marriage, and what she'd valued most about me was my ability to provide emotional safety and comfort. What I'd seen as love and partnership, she'd experienced as stagnation and limitation. What happens now? I asked. Lauren sat back down, her posture relaxing as we moved into practical territory. Now we handle this like adults. I was going to file for divorce next month anyway. This just accelerates the timeline. Next month? Frank and I want to be married by Christmas. We've been planning a small ceremony, just immediate family. She paused, perhaps recognizing how this sounded. I was hoping we could make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone. Everyone except me. Gerald, you'll be fine. You have your practice, your routines, your simple pleasures. You'll probably be happier without the pressure of trying to keep up with someone like me. The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. Even in the midst of revealing her complete betrayal, she was positioning herself as the one doing me a favor by leaving. As if my contentment with our life had been a burden she'd been generously carrying all these years. I trusted you, I said quietly. I know you did, and I'm sorry it had to end this way. But Gerald, we both deserve to be with someone who truly understands us. You deserve someone who appreciates your quiet strengths, and I deserve someone who shares my ambitions. She was rewriting our entire marriage as a mutual mismatch rather than a betrayal, transforming her infidelity into a kind of favor to both of us. It was masterful in its way, this ability to reframe devastating deception as enlightened self-awareness. When do you want me to move out? I asked. Lauren looked surprised. You don't have to move out immediately. We can work out the details through our lawyers. I'm not heartless, Gerald. Not heartless, just calculating, manipulative, and capable of maintaining an elaborate deception for years while planning my replacement. But not heartless. I stood up, feeling older than my 56 years. I'll contact a lawyer on Monday. Gerald, she called as I reached the kitchen doorway. When I turned back, she looked almost like the woman I'd thought I'd married. Almost. I really am sorry it happened this way. I never wanted to hurt you. I studied her face, looking for any sign that she understood the magnitude of what she'd done. But there was only mild regret, the kind of polite sadness someone might feel about a business decision that unfortunately affected other people. No, I said quietly. You just wanted to replace me. The hurt was just collateral damage. As I walked upstairs to our bedroom, I could hear Lauren on the phone, her voice animated in a way it hadn't been during our conversation. She was calling Frank, I realized, telling him that the secret was out, that they could accelerate their timeline, that the inconvenient husband had finally been dealt with. I sat on the edge of our bed, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was real. The woman downstairs wasn't the person I'd married, or maybe she was, and I'd simply never seen her clearly. Either way, the Gerald who'd woken up that morning believing in his marriage was as gone as the Lauren who'd once loved him. Tomorrow I would start the process of untangling 28 years of shared life. But tonight, I needed to grieve not just for my marriage, but for the man I'd been when I still believed in it. Monday morning, I sat across from David Morrison, the same lawyer who'd handled our wills 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that Lauren had consulted with his firm about divorcing me, while I was now seeking his help to protect myself from her plans. Gerald, I have to tell you, this is one of the most calculated divorce strategies I've seen in 30 years of practice, David said, reviewing the documents I'd brought him. Your wife has been building this case for a very long time. I nodded, watching him flip through photographs of the apartment, copies of the legal consultation notes, and printouts of Lauren's carefully documented evidence against me. What are my options? David leaned back in his leather chair, his expression thoughtful. Well, the good news is that her strategy depends on you being unprepared and uninformed. The fact that you discovered this before she filed changes everything. He tapped the consultation summary. She was planning to paint you as emotionally unavailable and financially irresponsible, but we can counter that narrative. How? With facts. You've been the stable, supportive spouse for 28 years. You've never been unfaithful, you've supported her career advancement, and you've managed your joint finances responsibly. David smiled grimly. More importantly, you have evidence of her systematic deception and adultery. That matters, even in a no-fault state. Over the next 2 hours, David walked me through the reality of my situation. While Texas was indeed a community property state, Lauren's adultery and deception could impact the division of assets. More importantly, her documented plans to manipulate the divorce proceedings could seriously undermine her credibility with a judge. There's something else, I said, pulling out a folder I'd prepared over the weekend. I've been doing some financial analysis. David raised an eyebrow as I spread out spreadsheets and bank statements across his desk. This was where my accounting background became invaluable. While Lauren had been busy documenting my alleged emotional failures, I'd been quietly tracking our financial reality. Lauren makes $200,000 a year as CEO, I explained. But our joint expenses have been running about $60,000 more than her salary for the past 3 years. I've been subsidizing her lifestyle without realizing it. David studied the numbers, his expression growing increasingly interested. How? My practice generates about $120,000 annually. I've been putting $80,000 into our joint account, keeping only $40,000 for my business expenses and personal needs. I thought I was being generous, allowing her to save more of her salary for our future. I pointed to a series of withdrawals from our savings account. But she's been drawing down our joint savings to maintain the apartment with Frank. The revelation was in the details. While I'd been living modestly and contributing most of my income to our shared expenses, Lauren had been using our joint resources to fund her separate life. The apartment rent, the dinners, the weekend trips I'd never taken, the gifts she'd given Frank, all of it had been paid for with money I'd earned and contributed to what I'd believed was our shared future. "This is fraud," David said bluntly. "She's been using marital assets to fund an adulterous relationship while planning to divorce you. That's going to significantly impact how a judge views the asset division." But I wasn't done. Over the weekend, I'd done something that felt foreign to my naturally trusting nature. I'd investigated my own wife's business dealings. What I'd found had shocked me even more than her personal betrayal. "There's more," I said, pulling out another set of documents. "Lauren's been positioning Frank to take over more responsibilities at Meridian Technologies. But according to the corporate filings I found, she's been doing it in ways that violate her fiduciary duty to the company's board." David's eyes sharpened. "Explain." "Frank was hired as vice president of business development 3 years ago, but Lauren's been systematically transferring responsibilities to him that should require board approval. She's essentially been grooming him to replace her as CEO while positioning herself as president. But she's never presented this reorganization to the board officially." I'd spent hours reviewing publicly available corporate documents, cross-referencing them with the business plan I'd found in their apartment. Lauren and Frank's vision for the company's future involved significant structural changes that would require stockholder approval. But according to the official records, these changes had never been properly presented or voted on. "She's been operating under the assumption that she can unilaterally restructure the company to benefit her relationship with Frank," I continued. "But the board doesn't know about their personal relationship, and they certainly don't know about the corporate reorganization she's been implementing without their approval." David was taking notes rapidly now. "Gerald, this isn't just about your divorce anymore. If what you're saying is accurate, Lauren could be facing serious professional consequences." The thought gave me no pleasure. I'd loved this woman for 28 years, and I took no joy in uncovering evidence that could destroy her career. But I also couldn't ignore the reality that she'd been systematically betraying not just me, but her professional obligations as well. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "We file first," David said without hesitation. "We get ahead of her narrative and present the facts before she can spin them. More importantly, we make sure the board at Meridian Technologies understands what's been happening under their noses." That afternoon, I did something that went against every instinct I'd developed over our 28-year marriage. I stopped protecting Lauren from the consequences of her actions. I called Richard Hayes, the chairman of Meridian's board of directors. Richard and I had met several times at company functions over the years, and I'd always liked his straightforward approach to business. "Gerald, what can I do for you?" Richard's voice was warm, unsuspecting. "Richard, I need to bring something to your attention regarding corporate governance issues at Meridian. It's complicated, but I think the board needs to be aware of some structural changes that may not have been properly authorized." There was a pause. "What kind of structural changes?" I spent the next 20 minutes carefully outlining what I'd discovered, sticking to facts and avoiding personal details about my marriage. Richard listened without interruption, his questions growing more pointed as I described the unauthorized reorganization that had been taking place. "Jesus, Gerald, are you saying Lauren's been implementing major corporate changes without board approval?" "I'm saying that based on the documents I've seen, there appears to be a significant disconnect between what's been happening operationally and what's been reported to the board." "And you're bringing this to me because?" I took a deep breath. "Because I believe in corporate integrity, and because the board has a right to know what's being done in their name." After I hung up, I sat in my office feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. For years, I'd been the supportive husband who cleaned up Lauren's messes, smoothed over her occasional ethical shortcuts, and provided the stable foundation that allowed her to take professional risks. Now I was the one creating consequences she'd have to face. That evening, Lauren came home later than usual. Her face was tight with stress, her usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges. "We need to talk," she said, setting her briefcase down with more force than necessary. About what? About the call Richard Hayes made to me this afternoon. About the corporate governance review the board has suddenly decided to conduct. Her eyes were hard, calculating. About the fact that my own husband is apparently trying to destroy my career. I met her gaze steadily. I shared factual information about corporate reorganization that appeared to lack proper authorization. Nothing more. Don't play innocent with me, Gerald. You knew exactly what you were doing. Yes, I did. The same way you knew exactly what you were doing when you spent 2 years planning my replacement. Lauren's composure finally cracked. This is different, and you know it. This affects my professional reputation, my ability to make a living. Your affair with Frank affects that too. The board's going to find out eventually that you've been restructuring the company to benefit your personal relationship. I just gave them a head start. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about me. The passive, supportive husband who'd never challenged her decisions was gone. In his place was someone who understood the value of information and wasn't afraid to use it. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to stop treating me like I'm stupid," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences beyond your personal happiness. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to quietly disappear just because it would be convenient for your new life plan." Lauren sat down across from me, her posture defensive. "The board review will pass. There's nothing illegal about operational restructuring." "Maybe not illegal, but unauthorized restructuring that benefits your romantic partner. That's going to be harder to explain, especially when the board realizes you never disclosed your relationship with Frank." I could see her working through the implications, her quick mind calculating the political and professional costs of her choices. For the first time since I'd discovered her betrayal, Lauren looked genuinely worried. "What's it going to take to make this go away?" she asked. "It's not going away, Lauren. You set this in motion when you decided to live a double life. Now we all have to deal with the consequences." "You're destroying everything I've worked for." I shook my head. "You destroyed it yourself. I'm just refusing to help you cover it up anymore." That night, as Lauren made phone calls behind closed doors, and I could hear the stress in her voice, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For 28 years, I'd been the one adapting, accommodating, making space for her ambitions and choices. Now, for the first time, she was the one having to adapt to consequences she couldn't control. It wasn't revenge exactly. It was something quieter but more powerful, the simple refusal to continue enabling someone who'd been systematically betraying me. Lauren had built her new life on the assumption that I would remain passive, predictable, manageable. She was about to discover how wrong that assumption had been. The next morning I filed for divorce, but more importantly, I stopped being the man who made Lauren's life easier at the expense of his own dignity. After 56 years of believing that love meant endless accommodation, I was finally learning that sometimes love means knowing when to stop. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment making coffee for one and finding genuine peace in the simplicity of it. The morning sun streamed through windows I'd chosen in a space that was entirely mine, free from the weight of deception and false harmony that had defined my life for so long. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. Despite Lauren's initial threats and manipulations, the evidence I'd gathered had shifted the entire dynamic of our settlement. When faced with documented proof of her adultery, financial deception, and professional misconduct, her lawyer had advised her to accept a more equitable division of assets than she'd originally planned. I kept the house, the one we'd shared for 20 years, but which I'd largely paid for with my contributions to our joint expenses. Lauren kept her retirement accounts and half of our savings, minus the amount she'd spent on maintaining her secret life with Frank. It was fair in a way that her original divorce strategy would never have been. But the real satisfaction came not from the financial settlement, but from watching Lauren face the consequences of choices she'd thought she could make without accountability. The corporate governance review at Meridian Technologies had been thorough and devastating. While the board hadn't found anything criminally actionable, they'd discovered a pattern of unauthorized decision-making and undisclosed conflicts of interest that had seriously undermined Lauren's credibility as a leader. Frank had been terminated immediately once his relationship with Lauren became known to the board. His position as vice president had been contingent on his professional judgment being uncompromised by personal interests, and his romantic involvement with the CEO represented an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Lauren had managed to keep her job, but barely. She'd been placed on probation, her decision-making authority had been significantly restricted, and she was required to report to a newly appointed chief operating officer who essentially supervised her every move. The woman who'd built her identity around professional power and autonomy was now working under closer oversight than she'd experienced since her first corporate job 20 years ago. Their apartment at Harbor View had been given up quietly. Frank had moved back to Denver, taking a position with a smaller firm at considerably less money than he'd been making at Meridian. Lauren had moved into a modest one-bedroom place, closer to her office. A significant downgrade from the luxury she'd become accustomed to. I learned about these developments not through direct contact, but through the small network of mutual friends and professional acquaintances that inevitably carried news in a city like ours. Some of these people had reached out to me after the divorce, expressing surprise at the circumstances and, in a few cases, apologizing for having believed Lauren's carefully constructed narrative about our marriage's decline. I had no idea. Sarah Martinez, one of Lauren's former colleagues, had told me when we'd run into each other at the grocery store. She made it sound like you'd grown apart gradually, like it was mutual. Nobody knew about Frank. These conversations had been validating in ways I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I'd really been as inadequate a husband as Lauren had claimed. Learning that even her closest professional friends had been deceived helped me understand that her capacity for manipulation extended far beyond our marriage. But the most profound change wasn't in Lauren's circumstances or in the validation I'd received from others. It was in my own relationship with myself. For the first time in decades, I was living without the constant undercurrent of someone else's dissatisfaction. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending trying to anticipate Lauren's needs, accommodate her moods, and compensate for whatever was missing in our relationship that I'd apparently been too dense to understand. My apartment was smaller than our house, but it felt spacious in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. I could read in the evening without worrying that my contentment with simple pleasures was somehow disappointing to someone who needed more stimulation. I could cook meals I actually wanted to eat instead of trying to impress someone who was probably texting her real partner while sitting across from me. I'd even started dating, something I'd thought would be impossible at 56 after 28 years of marriage. Margaret was a widow I'd met through my church, a gentle woman who appreciated conversation about books and enjoyed quiet dinners without needing them to be productions. She found my contentment with simple pleasures charming rather than limiting, and her uncomplicated affection was a revelation after years of trying to earn love from someone who'd been systematically withdrawing it. The strangest part was realizing how much happier I was without the marriage I'd thought I'd been fighting to save. Lauren had been right about one thing: we had grown incompatible, but not in the way she'd described. She'd become someone who could maintain elaborate deceptions while accepting love from someone she was actively betraying. I'd remained someone who believed in honesty, loyalty, and the possibility of working through problems together. Her version of growth had required discarding the values that had built our marriage. My version of growth was learning to protect those values from people who would exploit them. One evening in late spring, I was sitting on the small balcony of my apartment, reading and enjoying the sunset, when my phone rang. Lauren's name appeared on the screen, the first time she'd called since our divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer. We had nothing left to discuss, no shared obligations that required communication. But curiosity won. "Hello, Lauren." "Gerald." Her voice sounded tired, older somehow. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. What can I do for you?" There was a long pause. I wanted to apologize for how everything happened, for the way I handled things. I waited, saying nothing. I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, about the choices I made. Another pause. You didn't deserve what I put you through. No, I didn't. I convinced myself that our marriage was already over, that I was just being honest about reality. But the truth is, I ended it long before I admitted it to myself. I ended it when I decided you weren't enough anymore, instead of trying to work with you to build something better. I found myself genuinely curious about this conversation. What's prompted this reflection? Lauren let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but without humor. Losing everything I thought I wanted. Frank and I lasted exactly 6 weeks after he moved to Denver. Turns out our great love affair was more about the excitement of secrecy and the thrill of planning a new life than about actually wanting to live together day to day. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? She sounded genuinely curious. I considered the question honestly. Yes, I am. I'm sorry you threw away 28 years for something that wasn't real. I'm sorry you hurt so many people in pursuit of something that didn't exist. I'm sorry you discovered too late that what we had was actually valuable. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I'd just talked to you? If I'd been honest about feeling restless instead of creating this whole elaborate deception? Sometimes, I admitted. But Lauren, the problem wasn't that you felt restless or wanted more from life. The problem was that you chose deception and betrayal instead of honest communication. You chose to replace me instead of working with me. I know that now. Do you? Because even in this apology, you're focusing on the outcome that didn't work out for you, not on the damage you caused along the way. You're sorry that your strategy failed, not sorry that your strategy involved systematically lying to someone who loved you. Silence stretched between us. You're right, she said finally. Even now I'm still making it about me. Yes, you are. I hope you're happy, Gerald. I hope you found someone who appreciates what I was too selfish to value. I have. Her name is Margaret, and she's everything you never were. Honest, kind, and capable of love without manipulation. Good. You deserve that. After she hung up, I sat on my balcony as the sun finished setting, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this peaceful evening. A year ago, I'd been living a lie without knowing it. Married to someone who was systematically planning my replacement while accepting my love and support. Now I was alone, but not lonely. Starting over, but not starting from scratch. I'd learned that contentment wasn't a character flaw and that my capacity for loyalty and trust, while it had made me vulnerable to exploitation, was also what made me capable of real intimacy with someone who shared those values. Lauren had seen my satisfaction with our quiet life as evidence of my limitations. Margaret saw it as evidence of my ability to find joy in authentic connection rather than needing constant external validation. The difference wasn't in what I offered, but in who was receiving it. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on something that would have surprised the Gerald of a year ago. I was grateful for Lauren's betrayal. Not because I'd enjoyed the pain of discovery or the difficulty of divorce, but because it had freed me from a relationship that was slowly killing my spirit. For years, I'd been trying to be enough for someone who had decided I wasn't. I'd been accepting love as a conditional gift that could be withdrawn if I failed to meet evolving standards I was never allowed to understand. I'd been living in fear of disappointing someone who was already planning my replacement. Now I was living with someone who loved me, not despite my contentment with simple pleasures, but because of it. Someone who saw my loyalty as a gift rather than an expectation, my honesty as a treasure rather than a burden. At 56, I'd learned that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is losing something you thought you couldn't live without. Sometimes freedom comes disguised as loss, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone who's been systematically betraying you. Lauren had been right about one thing. We both deserved to be with someone who truly understood us. She deserved someone capable of the same level of deception and manipulation that she was. And I deserved someone whose love didn't come with conditions, expiration dates, and exit strategies. As I turned off the lights in my small, honest apartment, I realized that for the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged.